So this one is going to be kind of fun. We're going to ensure that we don't call dispatch if our component has unmounted because we're going to get a warning. So let me show you what we're talking about here. So if I choose Pikachu, then I'm going to get Pikachu loaded here, and that's great. But it does take a moment, and if I decide that I want to navigate away while I'm waiting for that to happen, then that can lead to a bit of a problem. So let me pull up our console here, and I'm going to say Charizard, and then navigate away, and kaboom. What happened between the time I chose Charizard and after I navigated is we made that request, and then I navigated, and then that request came back, and it tried to update the state, but we'd already unmounted the component where that state update was going to happen. And so React is like, hey, yo, just so that you know, you were trying to update state on a React component that is no longer exists. So it doesn't actually do anything, but you could have a memory leak in your application. So probably a good idea to cancel subscriptions and asynchronous tasks in a useEffect cleanup function instead. And so that's what we're going to be doing. For this last exercise, we're actually not going to cancel. We're going to let it continue because canceling is a whole ball of worms when it comes to promises. And I'm actually happy to let you work on that on your own because it is actually quite fascinating. You're going to use an abort controller with the fetch thing and everything like that. But all that we're going to do is ensure that we don't call the dispatch function if our component has unmounted. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to call this function unsafe dispatch. And so that unsafe prefix is just saying if you call this function, that's going to trigger a re-render even if the component's not been mounted. So then I'm going to make a dispatch function that's going to be a React use callback. And this is going to call the unsafe dispatch with all the same arguments. So we'll take any number of args, I don't really care, and forward all those args. This is just a typical wrapper function. And then we'll provide this array of dependencies here, which is empty because useReducer's dispatch function is stable. So far, so good. So now we need to make sure we don't call this function if our component has been unmounted. So what's the way that we know if a component's been unmounted? We're going to make a mounted ref here with React use ref. We'll initialize that to false, and then we'll need to set that value to true when this is actually mounted. So we're going to say React use effect right here, and then mounted ref.current equals true. All right, and then on top of that, we're going to return a cleanup function, which will be called when we're getting unmounted. So we'll return a cleanup function that's called when we're unmounted. So we can say mounted ref.current equals false. So when we first create this, it's not been mounted yet. When this function is called, it's now been mounted. When this function is called, we know that it's been unmounted, and then we'll add an empty dependency list to make sure this is only called on mount and on unmount. And then in here, we can say if mounted ref.current, then we know that it is mounted and it's safe to call the unsafe dispatch function. So we can save that now, and I'll come back over here to our example where we can navigate away, pull this up, clear this out. We'll choose Pikachu and then go back. And Pikachu loaded, but we didn't call the dispatch because this mounted ref.current was false. Now, just for the fun of this, I'm going to take this and make it a generic reusable hook. So let's come up here, and right at the top of our reducer, I'm going to make a function called use safe dispatch. This is going to take a dispatch function, or our unsafe dispatch function, and I'm going to grab all of this, and we're going to get our dispatch from use safe dispatch. We'll pass the unsafe dispatch here. And then I'm pasting all of that stuff in here, and now we're going to make a few changes. So we don't even need to give this a name. We'll just return this, and we'll change this to dispatch. And now we're going to get a underline here. What is going on here? Well, as it happens, ESLint knew before that this dispatch function was coming from useReducer, but now it can't track across function calls. And so we are going to have to just add dispatch to our array list here. But that's not a problem because the dispatch function is stable anyway. And so this will never change. So we don't need to worry about that. We'll just include it even though it's not going to change. And now this continues to work. So let's just make sure that everything's working. So we go to Charizard, we go to a different exercise, and no warnings. Awesome. So in review, what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, I've got this dispatch function. I don't necessarily want to call it if we have unmounted. And so I'm going to keep track of our mounting status with this mounted ref, We'll initialize that to false here, and then we'll have a use effect where we'll set that current value to true because now we know that we have mounted at this point, and we'll return a cleanup function that sets that mounted current value to false. So once we are cleaning up, we know we're no longer mounted. And then we'll make use of use callback to ensure that our own version of this dispatch function is stable. We'll take all the arguments that were passed and forward them along to dispatch, so that it's just a simple wrapper, but then we check whether we're currently mounted before we call that dispatch. Now we'll learn more about this here pretty soon, but I'm going to add use layout effect here, and this will ensure that this function is going to be called as soon as we're mounted without waiting for the browser to paint the screen. And it will also ensure that this cleanup is called as soon as we're unmounted without waiting for anything either. And that is use safe dispatch. So now we can use this custom hook inside of our own custom hook, and it's hooks all the way down. Oh, and it looks like there's one last thing we need to do here. I just noticed we need to add that dispatch to our array list here, but thankfully, because use safe dispatch is memoizing the dispatch function it returns with use callback, that isn't going to be a problem for the memoized run function that we're creating here. And I'll just reiterate, this is the reason why I don't suggest that you use callback for every function you define in your application, because as you can see, it kind of spiders all over your code base when you start memoizing things. So while it is valuable to do in some instances, only do it when you're actually deriving the value. As you can see, we're not doing it down here because we wouldn't get any value out of doing it for those event handlers.